The clock on Sarah Martinez's bedroom wall read 3:17 a.m. when she first heard it, a whimper so desperate and pain that it jolted her from sleep like an electric shock. She sat up immediately, her heart racing, knowing something was terribly wrong. Her 7-year-old golden retriever, Honey, had been sleeping peacefully in her dog bed beside the window just hours earlier, her soft snores a comforting backdrop to Sarah's evening reading. Now, as Sarah stumbled down the hallway in her pajamas, switching on lights as she went, she found Honey panting heavily in the kitchen, her body trembling violently. The dog's eyes were wide with panic and confusion, and her breathing came in ragged, desperate gasps. Sarah had never seen Honey like this before. In all her years of owning the dog, she'd never witnessed such raw fear and discomfort etched across the loyal animal's face. "Oh, Honey, what's wrong, girl?" Sarah whispered, kneeling beside her trembling companion and running her hand along the dog's side. But even as she spoke, realization crashed over her like a wave. The heat cycle, the pregnancy. Sarah's mind spun backward through the months, searching for an explanation that made no sense. Honey had been indoors during every heat cycle without exception. Sarah had been meticulous about this, determined never to allow her beloved pet to roam unsupervised or mate with stray dogs. She kept Honey securely inside the house, away from any possibility of accidental pregnancy. Yet here Honey was, clearly in active labor. With shaking hands, Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed Riverside Animal Hospital. The night emergency line picked up after 2 rings. "My dog is in labor," Sarah explained breathlessly to the veterinary technician who answered. "She shouldn't be pregnant. Something is very wrong." The technician's voice remained calm and professional, walking Sarah through basic questions. How old was the dog? Had she eaten or drunk anything unusual? Any recent trauma or exposure to medications? But Sarah barely heard the questions. She was already moving, grabbing her purse and car keys, scooping Honey gently into her arms and carrying her to the waiting car parked in the garage. The drive to Riverside Animal Hospital took 15 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah's mind raced with worry and confusion. She broke every traffic law getting there, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Honey panted in the passenger seat, a thin line of saliva dripping from her mouth. Occasionally, her body would stiffen as a contraction gripped her, and Sarah would reach over to stroke the dog's head, whispering constant reassurances even though she herself was terrified. Dr. James was waiting at the emergency entrance when Sarah pulled up. In 20 years of practice, he'd learned to read the desperation in an owner's voice during phone consultations. He helped Sarah carefully lift Honey from the car and carry her inside to the examination room, where the sterile white walls and beeping monitors created an atmosphere of clinical urgency. "Let's see what we've got here," Doctor said, his voice calm and professional as he began examining Honey. Sarah stood nearby, wringing her hands, watching every movement of the veterinarian's experienced hands. Doctor's brow furrowed as he palpated Honey's abdomen, feeling the movement of puppies inside her womb. "She's definitely pregnant," he confirmed, "and she's definitely in active labor. This should progress fairly quickly now." "But how?" Sarah blurted out. "She's never been outside unsupervised. I've been so careful. I kept her inside during her heat cycle. She never left the house." Doctor looked up from his examination, his dark eyes thoughtful and curious. "That is unusual," he admitted. "But sometimes dogs find ways. Maybe she got out somehow. A door left open when you weren't looking. Sometimes they can slip past us faster than we realize." Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, doctor, I'm absolutely certain. My backyard is completely fenced and my garage door opener is in my car. There's no way she got out." Over the next 6 hours, Doctor and his night team worked with Honey as the dog labored to deliver her impossible litter. Sarah remained in the room the entire time, holding Honey's head and offering comfort and encouragement. She watched as Doctor and the technicians prepared sterile cloths, heated blankets, and oxygen equipment, ready for any complications. The first puppy arrived at 4:23 a.m., a tiny golden form slick with amniotic fluid, mewling softly as the technician gently cleaned its airway and placed it on a warming pad. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the miracle of new life, despite her confusion about how it had come to exist. "There's one," Doctor said with a slight smile, though his eyes remained thoughtful and puzzled. But then another came, and another, and another. By 6:00 a.m., Honey had delivered 10 puppies. By 7:30 a.m., she delivered 15. Sarah lost count at some point, her attention divided between the miracle unfolding before her and the growing sense of strangeness that nagged at her consciousness. 15 puppies was an exceptionally large litter for a single dog. Doctor seemed increasingly preoccupied as the numbers mounted, occasionally pausing to study individual newborns with an intensity that went beyond routine veterinary examination. As the morning sun began to filter through the hospital's windows, painting everything in soft golden light, Honey lay exhausted but alive, surrounded by her enormous brood. The puppies, still wet and blind, squeaked and squirmed blindly, searching instinctively for their mother's warmth and nourishment. It was beautiful and overwhelming and completely inexplicable. Doctor stepped back and allowed Sarah to approach her dog. Sarah knelt beside Honey, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her beloved companion and her impossible family. "You did it, girl," Sarah whispered. "You're a mama. What an incredible mama you are." But as she looked more closely at the puppies, something began to feel off. She couldn't quite identify what it was at first. The puppies looked vaguely normal, certainly canine in basic shape and structure, yet there was something subtly wrong about them. One puppy's ears seemed too pointed, almost fox-like in their sharpness. Another's snout appeared too narrow, too finely tapered compared to what golden retriever puppies typically looked like. A third had eyes that, even though still closed, seemed positioned strangely in its skull, set wider apart than they should be, almost predatory in their potential configuration. Sarah mentioned none of this to Doctor, not wanting to sound paranoid or neurotic. Instead, she focused on the relief that Honey was healthy and the delivery had been successful. But as she watched Doctor examine each puppy methodically, taking careful notes on a clipboard, she noticed him pausing, slowing down, his brow furrowing deeper with each creature he assessed. Finally, Doctor turned to Sarah, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes betraying deep concern. "Everything appears healthy," he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious precision. "All 15 puppies seem viable. Honey's vitals are good. She's tired but doing well after such a large delivery." "But," Sarah prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. Doctor set down his clipboard and met Sarah's gaze directly. "But I'd like to do some additional examinations," he said carefully. "Just routine things, perhaps some x-rays. I want to make absolutely certain everything is as normal as it appears. Is that all right with you?" Sarah nodded, trusting the veterinarian she'd worked with for 7 years. "Of course, whatever you think is best." What neither Sarah nor Doctor could have anticipated as the sun rose higher that morning was that this moment, this impossible birth of 15 puppies from a dog that should never have been pregnant, was about to unravel into something far stranger, far darker, and far more significant than anyone could have imagined. The answers to how this had happened, and what these creatures truly were, would take them all on a journey that would challenge science, law, ethics, and their fundamental understanding of the boundaries between nature and human ambition. But for now, in the quiet, sterile room of Riverside Animal Hospital, there was only the soft mewing of newborn puppies, the exhausted breathing of their mother, and the growing sense among those present that something deeply, profoundly wrong had just entered their world. Sarah brought the 15 creatures home from Riverside Animal Hospital on a bright Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the birth. Doctor had advised her to keep them under close observation for the first week, nodding that the puppies seemed healthy but recommending frequent check-ins. "Call me immediately if anything seems unusual," he'd said, his tone carrying a weight of concern that made Sarah's stomach flutter with anxiety. She'd assumed he meant the standard worries: feeding problems, infections, developmental delays. What she didn't know was that doctor was already conducting genetic tests and consulting quietly with colleagues about the peculiarities he'd observed. The first hint of something being profoundly wrong came at midnight on Friday night. Sarah was awakened by sounds emanating from the makeshift puppy pen she'd set up in her living room. Not the typical sounds of puppies, the adorable squeaking and whimpering that people found endearing. These sounds were different, calculated, deliberate. Sarah stumbled downstairs in the darkness, flipping on the living room light, and froze at what she witnessed. The 15 creatures were engaged in a coordinated hunt. One of them had wandered to the edge of the pen and discovered a cricket that had somehow made its way inside through an open window. What should have been a chaotic, clumsy response from newborn puppies became something else entirely. The creature didn't simply pounce randomly as puppies would. Instead, it froze, its tiny body going rigid. Then, as if responding to a silent signal, the other 14 creatures turned in unison and moved toward the same corner of the pen. Their movements weren't the stumbling, uncoordinated gait of 3-day-old puppies. They moved with precision, with purpose, like predators executing a practiced strategy. Sarah watched in transfixed horror as the creatures fanned out, creating a semicircle around the cricket. The insect jumped, and instead of the chaotic scrambling one would expect, the creatures responded as a single organism, cutting off every escape route. The cricket didn't stand a chance. Within seconds, it was gone. The creatures gathered around the spot where it had been, making soft clicking sounds to one another, sounds that bore an unsettling resemblance to communication. Sarah's hands trembled as she sank into a nearby chair. She pulled out her phone and recorded the next 2 hours of activity. The creatures didn't sleep. They should have been sleeping. Newborn puppies slept constantly, their bodies demanding rest as they grew. But these creatures remained alert, their eyes tracking everything in the room with an intelligence that seemed far too advanced for 3-day-old animals. They played, but not in the way puppies played. Their play resembled tactical exercises, each creature practicing movements, testing its physical capabilities, learning its body with an almost conscious awareness. Around 3 a.m., Sarah watched as one of the larger creatures approached the pen's edge and stood on its hind legs. For nearly 8 minutes, the creature remained upright, its front paws balanced against the pen's wall, staring at its reflection in the darkened television screen. It tilted its head, studying its own image. Then it reached out tentatively, as if trying to touch the reflected form, confusion and fascination evident in its posture. Sarah felt goosebumps rise along her arms. That behavior wasn't puppyish. That was self-awareness. That was consciousness. When another creature made a sound, a low, guttural vocalization, the standing creature turned immediately and responded with the same sound, only slightly different in pitch and inflection. It wasn't barking. It wasn't whining. It was communicative. It was almost like talking. By sunrise, Sarah had recorded hours of footage and barely slept. She immediately called doctor's office and left an urgent message, her voice shaking. "Something's very wrong with the puppies. They're not acting normal. I don't know how to explain it. Can you call me back as soon as possible?" Doctor returned her call within an hour, his professional demeanor masking obvious concern. "Send me the video," he instructed. "I want to see exactly what you're describing." Sarah texted the footage, and within 10 minutes, Doctor called back. "I'm coming over," he said without preamble. "Don't let anyone else near those animals. I'm serious, Sarah. No one. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Doctor arrived at Sarah's house, he came alone but with a leather bag containing equipment Sarah didn't recognize. He examined each creature methodically, taking measurements, noting behavioral patterns and collecting hair and skin samples. His expression grew darker with each examination. He said very little, mostly murmuring observations to himself as he worked. Finally, he sat down in Sarah's kitchen, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "Sarah, I need to ask you something very important, and I need you to think carefully before answering. Has Honey been outside your home in the past 6 months? Any time at all?" Sarah frowned, thinking back. "No, I don't think. Wait. Actually, yes. There was that one time about 6 months ago. She got out somehow. It was only for a couple of hours, but the neighbor found her 2 blocks away. She seemed confused when they brought her back. I always wondered how she got out because the gate was closed." Doctor's expression confirmed Sarah's worst fears. "I think someone stole Honey," he said quietly. "I think someone took her, and I think they deliberately impregnated her with something. I don't know what yet, but these creatures, they're not normal puppies, Sarah. Their physiology is wrong. Their behavior is wrong. They're displaying cognitive abilities that shouldn't exist in animals this young." Sarah felt the room spin slightly. "What are you saying? What do you mean they're not normal? They're not. What exactly are they?" "I don't know yet," Doctor admitted, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "But I'm going to find out. In the meantime, I need you to be very careful. These creatures are intelligent in ways that concern me. I want to run genetic tests immediately. Full sequencing. This requires expertise beyond standard veterinary medicine." Over the following days, as Sarah observed the creatures more carefully with this new knowledge, the evidence became increasingly disturbing. The creatures demonstrated problem-solving abilities. When Sarah changed their pen's layout, they adapted instantly, navigating the new configuration without confusion. They began responding to specific sounds, not commands, but specific vocalizations that seemed to mean something to them. When one creature made a particular clicking sound, the others would gather. Another sound meant something else entirely, and the creatures would shift their behavior accordingly. One morning, Sarah found that one of the creatures had partially escaped the pen by organizing the others into a living ladder. The smallest creatures had climbed onto the backs of the larger ones, creating a staircase that allowed the escape artist to reach the pen's edge and pull itself over. It had taken intelligence, cooperation, and planning. Sarah had found the escaped creature sitting calmly in the kitchen, waiting, as if it knew she'd find it there. Sarah began documenting everything obsessively. She recorded videos constantly, took photographs of unusual behaviors, and maintained detailed notes about what each creature was learning and exhibiting. The more she observed, the more terrified she became. These weren't puppies. They might look vaguely like puppies, but they were something fundamentally different, something deliberately created, something unknown. On the 7th day after the birth, Sarah sat on her couch, watching the creatures in their pen, and felt a deep chill of dread settle into her bones. Whatever these beings were, wherever they had come from, one thing was clear: her life had changed forever. The innocent act of bringing newborn puppies home had instead brought something far stranger and far more significant into her world. And as she watched the creatures communicate with each other in their mysterious clicking language, their intelligent eyes tracking every movement, every shadow, Sarah realized with absolute certainty that this mystery was far larger and far darker than anyone had yet imagined. She reached for her phone and called Doctor again. "You need to come back," she said quietly, "and you need to bring help, professional help. These things, Doctor, I think you were right. I think someone created them deliberately, and I think we need to find out who." "Doctor." James sat in his home office late on a Friday night, the blue light of his computer screen casting harsh shadows across his face. In front of him lay the preliminary genetic analysis reports from the Colorado State University laboratory. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the data, rereading sections multiple times. Hopping each reading would reveal a different conclusion. It didn't. The results remained the same, no matter how many times he examined them. Impossible. That was the only word that kept echoing through his mind. Impossible, impossible, impossible. The genetic sequencing showed DNA markers that didn't belong together. According to the analysis, the creature's genetic material contained sequences consistent with multiple species: canine, certainly, but also coyote, fox, and something else that the laboratory couldn't immediately identify. The lab technician, Dr. Owens, had called him directly when she finished the preliminary analysis. "Doctor," she'd said, her voice carefully controlled but trembling slightly beneath the professional veneer, "I've run this analysis 4 times. I had 2 other technicians run it independently. We keep getting the same results. This shouldn't be possible." "What exactly are you telling me?" Doctor had asked, though he already knew. "I'm telling you that those creatures you sent samples from aren't natural hybrids," had replied. "Natural hybrids happen occasionally when different canine species mate. But this is deliberate genetic engineering. Someone took genetic material from multiple species and combined it deliberately. The precision is remarkable. Whoever did this understood advanced molecular genetics and had access to sophisticated equipment." After ending the call, Doctor had spent the last 6 hours staring at the genetic readouts, his mind struggling to comprehend the implications. Someone had engineered these creatures. Someone with significant scientific knowledge and resources. Someone who had deliberately stolen Sarah's dog and used it as a living incubator for their genetic experiment. The ethical violations were staggering. The cruelty was incomprehensible. But most terrifying of all was the fact that whoever had done this possessed capabilities that should only exist in the most advanced research facilities in the world. Doctor's phone rang at 11:47 p.m. The caller ID showed Colorado Parks and Wildlife Division. He answered immediately, recognizing the number as belonging to someone he'd contacted confidentially earlier that evening. "Doctor, this is James from Wildlife Biology," the voice on the other end said. "You sent us some preliminary genetic data about unusual creatures in your care. I need to see you tomorrow morning, in person, and I'm bringing someone from our legal department. This is bigger than we initially thought." The next morning, Doctor met with James and Maria Santos, a legal specialist for the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Division. They arrived at Riverside Animal Hospital with serious expressions and official credentials. Doctor had prepared a presentation containing all the genetic data, photographic evidence, and behavioral observations he documented. As he walked them through the information, he watched their expressions shift from skepticism to concern to something resembling genuine alarm. "This is a crime," Maria said flatly. "This isn't just animal abuse, though it's certainly that. This is violation of federal wildlife protection laws. If these creatures contain genetic material from protected species, multiple state and federal regulations have been violated." James examined the creatures themselves with the clinical precision of a scientist who'd seen many strange things but never anything quite like this. He took measurements, documented behaviors, and collected additional samples. His jaw tightened as he worked. "How many of these are there?" he finally asked. "As far as we know, just the 15, Doctor replied. "But we suspect there might be others. Whoever created these likely produced more than one litter." "We need to contact the FBI, Maria said decisively. "And we need to do it today. This situation has just moved beyond state jurisdiction." Within 48 hours, federal agents arrived. They were accompanied by Dr. Richard from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a geneticist with gray hair and steel-gray eyes that seemed to absorb information with frightening efficiency. Doctor examined the creatures, reviewed the genetic data, and then sat down in Doctor's office looking deeply troubled. "These are among the most sophisticated hybrid creatures I've ever encountered," Doctor said quietly. "The genetic engineering involved here represents years of research and development. Someone didn't just do this on a whim. This was a deliberate, planned program." "Do you know who might have the capability to do this?" Doctor asked. "A handful of researchers worldwide," Doctor replied. "Maybe a dozen. But the ones I know about all have institutional oversight, ethical review boards, federal supervision. Whoever did this was operating in secret, without any regulatory oversight whatsoever. The federal investigation intensified rapidly. Agents interviewed Sarah extensively, asking detailed questions about Honey's disappearance 6 months earlier. They reviewed security footage from her neighborhood. They contacted local shelters and veterinary clinics, searching for records of similar cases. What they discovered was chilling. 3 other dog owners in the Denver area had reported delivering litters of genetically unusual puppies. In one case, a woman named No Relation to Doctor had found the litter so disturbing that she'd taken them to an animal shelter, claiming she couldn't care for them. The shelter had subsequently adopted out 15 hybrid creatures to unsuspecting families before anyone realized something was wrong. Federal agents had to track down families who'd adopted the hybrids, creating a complicated and disturbing situation. Another case involved a man named Robert who'd noticed his dog acting strangely 2 weeks after an unexplained absence. When the dog gave birth, recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with the puppies. He'd kept them secured and contacted authorities out of concern. In total, federal investigators identified 43 hybrid creatures that had been created and distributed over an 18-month period. "This is a breeding program," Doctor explained to the assembled team of federal agents, state wildlife officials, and local law enforcement. "Someone has been systematically stealing dogs and using them to create hybrid creatures, and they've been selling the ones that turned out well to private collectors." "For what purpose?" asked FBI agent Sarah Mitchell, a sharp-eyed woman with a notebook and penetrating gaze. "That's the question we need to answer," Doctor replied. "But based on the sophistication of the genetic engineering and the deliberate selection of species traits, I'd theorize they were trying to create a new kind of animal, something with certain characteristics they deemed desirable." The investigation eventually led to a remote facility in the mountains north of Denver. The property was registered to a shell corporation, but federal agents traced the ownership back to a single individual, Dr. Wellington, a geneticist who'd been dismissed from the University of Colorado 20 years earlier for conducting unethical experiments on animal genetics. Dr. Wellington had disappeared from legitimate scientific circles after his dismissal. He'd been working in secret for 2 decades, apparently obsessed with creating something revolutionary. When federal agents finally raided Dr. Wellington's facility on a cold Tuesday morning, what they found shocked even the most experienced investigators. The warehouse-sized building contained dozens of enclosures. Inside those enclosures were approximately 43 hybrid creatures, all suffering from neglect and inappropriate living conditions. Dr. Wellington was found in his laboratory, surrounded by computers displaying genetic sequences and breeding records. His notebooks documented 2 decades of obsessive work, detailed plans for creating the perfect hybrid, and extensive notes on which creatures had been deemed successful and which had been disposed of. But what truly horrified everyone was the scale of his ambition. His research notes outlined plans for creating multiple new hybrid species. He documented which creatures were scheduled for which private collectors. He'd outlined his vision for a future where wealthy individuals could purchase exotic hybrid creatures that combined the intelligence and loyalty of dogs with predatory instincts and capabilities of wild animals. It was, quite simply, one of the most disturbing criminal enterprises ever uncovered. As Doctor reviewed the evidence collected from Dr. Wellington's facility, sitting in a federal conference room surrounded by agents and specialists, the full horror of the situation became clear. The 15 creatures in Sarah's home weren't miracles or accidents. They were the products of criminal genius, carefully engineered to fulfill one madman's twisted vision. And the question that haunted everyone present was the same. What exactly had he created? And what would happen to these creatures now that their true nature was finally known? The interrogation room at the FBI's Denver field office was deliberately austere. White walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and harsh fluorescent lighting that cast no shadows. Dr. Wellington sat on one side of the table, his hands cuffed before him. FBI agent Sarah Mitchell sat across from him, a thick folder of evidence spread before her. Doctor watched from behind one-way glass, his stomach churning as he observed the man who'd orchestrated the nightmare that had consumed the past 2 weeks. Dr. Wellington was not what Doctor had expected. He'd imagined some obvious monster, someone whose appearance betrayed their depravity. Instead, Wellington was an unassuming man in his mid-60s, with graying hair, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a calm demeanor that bordered on serene. He looked like he could have been anyone's grandfather. That made it worse somehow. "Dr. Wellington," Agent Mitchell began, her voice devoid of emotion, "we have your facility, your research notes, your breeding records, and 43 living specimens of hybrid creatures. We have documentation of stolen dogs going back 18 months. We have evidence of sales to private collectors. Would you like to tell us your side of this story?" Wellington was silent for a long moment, his fingers interlacing on the table before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was remarkably calm. "I assume you've read my research notes," he said. It wasn't a question. "We have," Agent Mitchell confirmed. "Explain what you were trying to accomplish." Wellington leaned back slightly, seemingly unbothered by his predicament. "For 20 years I've had a vision," he began. "A vision of something that could revolutionize human-animal relationships. The world has dogs, loyal, intelligent animals that live alongside humans, but they're limited by their genetic constraints. They lack the cognitive capabilities for truly complex communication. They lack certain survival instincts. They lack the adaptability that wild animals possess." Doctor felt a chill run through him as he listened to Wellington's methodical explanation. "I theorized that by combining genetic material from multiple canine and wild species, carefully selected traits from dogs, coyotes, foxes, I could create something entirely new," Wellington continued. "A creature that possessed the loyalty and social bonding capability of domesticated dogs, combined with the intelligence, adaptability, and survival instincts of wild predators. A perfect companion for discerning individuals." "You created abominations," Agent Mitchell said flatly. "You committed animal cruelty on a massive scale. You stole people's pets. You violated federal wildlife protection laws. And you were selling these creatures to private collectors without any oversight regarding their welfare or containment." Wellington's expression didn't change. "I created the future," he said calmly. "Everything has a cost. Rome wasn't built in a day, and revolutionary science requires sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" Agent Mitchell's voice rose slightly. "You violated the bodies of innocent animals. You caused them pain and trauma. You separated them from their owners. One dog owner, Mrs., trusted you implicitly. She brought her dog to the veterinary clinic you were posing as. You drugged the animal, stole her, impregnated her with your genetic material, and returned her. Do you understand what you did to that woman?" Wellington remained unmoved. Collateral damage in service of progress. Behind the glass, Doctor felt rage building in his chest. This man showed no remorse whatsoever. He viewed the suffering he'd caused as inconsequential compared to his scientific ambitions. Agent Mitchell opened the folder and began laying out photographs. "Let's talk about the dogs you stole," she said. "We've identified 15 confirmed cases of dogs that went missing in the Denver area over the past 18 months, all within a 3-week period following their heat cycles. In each case, the dogs were later found pregnant with hybrid litters. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. Tell me about your theft operations." Wellington hesitated, and for the first time a flicker of something, perhaps calculation, crossed his face. "I need representation," he said finally. "I'm not saying anything else without my attorney present." The interrogation ended there, but the evidence was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors were already building a case that would ultimately result in multiple felony charges. In the days that followed, investigators continued uncovering the scope of Wellington's operation. They discovered that he hadn't been working entirely alone. Two accomplices, a former veterinary technician named Daniel and a logistics specialist named Karen, had been actively involved in the kidnapping operations, had posed as a veterinary student at various clinics, using those positions to gain access to female dogs during their heat cycles, had maintained the records, coordinated the artificial inseminations, and managed the sales to private collectors. The private collector network was perhaps the most disturbing discovery. Investigators identified at least 12 wealthy individuals across multiple states who'd purchased hybrid creatures from Wellington, paying between $50,000 and $200,000 per animal. Some of these collectors had kept the creatures in inappropriate conditions. One collector in California had kept 5 hybrids in a basement without adequate light or exercise space. Another in Texas had tried to use them as guard animals, forcing them into aggressive behaviors that traumatized the sensitive creatures. As federal agents tracked down the purchased hybrids, they found an array of troubling situations. Some collectors had formed genuine attachments to the creatures, treating them as cherished pets despite their unusual nature. Others had grown bored or frightened by their intelligence and strange behaviors, neglecting or abusing them. The most horrifying discovery came when investigators found Wellington's records. Over the 18-month period of his operation, he'd created not 43 creatures, but over 60. The ones that hadn't met his exacting standards, or those with genetic abnormalities that disappointed him, had been killed. The notebooks documented each death in clinical, emotionless language that made investigators' skin crawl. Subject 47, excessive anxiety responses, euthanized 214. Subject 52, cognitive development insufficient, euthanized 33. Subject 59, physical deformity limiting mobility, euthanized 41. Each entry was like a window into Wellington's twisted mind, a mind that saw these creatures not as living beings but as experimental subjects, tools to be discarded if they failed to meet his specifications. During a follow-up interrogation after speaking with his attorney, Wellington was presented with evidence of the. Surprisingly, he responded without defensiveness. "Yes, I eliminated the defective ones," he said matter-of-factly, as any responsible researcher would. The ones that remained, those were successful iterations. Those were the ones capable of fulfilling my vision. "They're not experiments," Agent Mitchell said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They're living creatures. They have feelings, they suffer, they mourn. You've turned them into commodities." Wellington's response was chilling in its conviction. "They're a new species," he said, "and like any new species, not all members are viable. That's not cruelty, that's evolution." As the investigation deepened, Sarah Martinez was brought in to secure federal interviews. Investigators needed her testimony regarding everything she'd observed about Honey's behavior and the 15 creatures' development. Sarah recounted the night Honey had vanished 6 months earlier, a night she now understood had been orchestrated by Wellington's accomplices. "I heard a noise in the backyard," Sarah explained to the agents. "My security camera showed 2 people cutting through the fence with bolt cutters. They had Honey sedated within minutes. I remember seeing the red laser pointer on the tranquilizer, and then she was gone. I filed a police report, but the officers thought she'd just wandered off. Nobody told me she'd been stolen. Nobody told me she'd been violated." The realization that Honey had been deliberately targeted, deliberately victimized, sent Sarah into tears. When she later learned that other dogs had suffered the same fate, that dozens of animals had been violated in Wellington's twisted crusade, her grief transformed into cold determination. She began working with federal prosecutors to build the strongest possible case against Wellington and his accomplices. By the time formal charges were filed, the scope of Wellington's criminal enterprise was fully documented. 27 counts of animal cruelty, 18 counts of interstate commerce in protected wildlife, conspiracy charges, wire fraud, theft, and federal charges related to the unlicensed genetic engineering and creation of hybrid species without proper regulatory oversight. The prosecution estimated that Wellington's operation had caused suffering to over 60 animals, enriched him by more than $2 million, and created a situation that threatened established wildlife regulations and animal welfare standards nationwide. As Doctor reviewed the formal charges filed in court, reading the detailed recitation of Wellington's crimes, he felt simultaneously vindicated and devastated. Vindicated that his instinct that something was terribly wrong had been correct. Devastated that the truth was so dark, so comprehensive, and so deliberately cruel. Wellington had spent 20 years perfecting a crime that violated every principle of ethical science and basic humanity. The question that now haunted everyone involved in the case was no longer, who did this? Or how did they do it? The question had become something far more profound and troubling. What would happen now to the living creatures that were the products of Wellington's obsession? The story broke nationally on a Thursday morning when the New York Times published a comprehensive investigation titled, "The Secret Lab Where a Disgraced Scientist Created Hybrid Creatures to Sell to the Wealthy." Within hours, every major news outlet in America was running the story. Cable news networks went into overdrive, interrupting regular programming to provide updates. Social media exploded with outrage, conspiracy theories, and passionate debates about genetic ethics. By Friday morning, Sarah Martinez's phone was receiving hundreds of calls per day. Producers from every major television network wanted interviews. Podcast hosts wanted her story. Documentary filmmakers were already drafting proposals. The media frenzy intensified when satellite trucks began parking on her residential street and news helicopters circled her home. Sarah had become the unwilling public face of the crisis. The first interview Sarah gave was to NBC's Today Show. She appeared on Monday morning, visibly nervous, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair as millions of Americans watched. The host, Richard, began with softballs before moving to harder questions. "Sarah, can you describe what you felt when you discovered these creatures weren't normal puppies?" Richard asked. Sarah's voice trembled as she recounted the cricket hunting incident, the coordinated behaviors, the unsettling intelligence in their eyes. "They weren't what I expected," she said. "I knew something was profoundly wrong, but I never imagined the truth would be this dark. I never imagined they were deliberately created by someone trying to build a new species." "And how do you feel about Dr. Wellington now?" Richard pressed. "I feel," Sarah paused, struggling for words. "I feel rage. I feel betrayed. My dog, Honey, was violated. Her body was used without consent. And these creatures, whatever they are, they're innocent victims of his ambition. They didn't ask to exist. They didn't ask to be created. And now their entire future is uncertain." The interview went viral immediately. Clips were shared across social media platforms millions of times. Sarah's name trended on Twitter within minutes. She received thousands of supportive messages, but also plenty of angry ones. Some people called her irresponsible for not immediately euthanizing the creatures. Others demanded that she protect them at all costs. The public's reaction split into distinct camps almost immediately. The first camp viewed the creatures as abominations, unnatural perversions of nature created through unethical science. They argued that was the only humane option, that keeping these creatures alive was a violation of natural order. Online forums filled with passionate arguments about the dangers of genetic engineering and the need for strict international bans on hybrid creature creation. Religious groups were particularly vocal. Several prominent evangelical leaders issued statements condemning genetic engineering as playing God and violating the sanctity of creation. The Vatican released a statement expressing concern about ethical boundaries in genetic research. Islamic scholars debated whether the creatures had legal standing in Islamic jurisprudence. The second camp viewed the creatures as victims deserving compassion and protection. Animal rights organizations to defend them, launching campaigns with hashtags like Save the Hybrids and Not Abominations. Celebrities, including actress Jane, released statements calling for the creatures to be protected and cared for humanely. "These beings are innocent," said in an interview. "They didn't choose to exist. They deserve our compassion, not our judgment." The third camp was scientifically curious, wanting to study the creatures to advance genetic knowledge. Researchers from prestigious universities submitted proposals to the National Institutes of Health requesting permission to conduct extensive studies on the hybrids. Geneticists debated the implications of what Wellington had accomplished, some arguing his work, while unethical, could provide valuable scientific insights. The media coverage became increasingly sensationalized. Tabloid newspapers ran headlines like "Monster Puppies," "The Creatures Science Created," and "Designer Demons. Are these genetic freaks safe?" One cable news network created a special report with ominous music and dramatic graphics titled "The Hybrid Threat." Could these creatures be dangerous? The truth was more complex than the sensationalism suggested. The creatures were intelligent, yes. They were different from normal dogs, absolutely. But they were also frightened, traumatized animals that had been separated from their mother, thrust into public scrutiny, and uncertain about their own existence. Sarah's phone rang during the second week of media coverage. It was Doctor, and his voice was urgent. "Sarah, you need to be careful what you say to the media," he warned. "There's a congressman from Texas who's introduced a bill that would classify the creatures as dangerous wildlife and require immediate. If public opinion shifts too far toward fear, that bill could pass." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Can he do that? Can they just order them killed? "They can try," Doctor said grimly. "And if enough people are frightened enough, it might work. The creatures need a voice right now. They need someone defending them." That evening, Sarah gave an interview to a sympathetic journalist from The Atlantic. She spoke honestly about her initial fear, her growing attachment to the creatures, and her belief that they deserved a chance at life. "I was terrified of them at first," Sarah admitted. "I thought they were monsters, but as I spent time with them, I realized they're just confused, traumatized animals. They're not evil. They're not inherently dangerous. They're victims of circumstance, and I believe with all my heart that they deserve our compassion, not our condemnation." The article went viral within hours. It humanized Sarah in a way that changed the conversation. Instead of viewing her as the owner of monster creatures, the public began seeing her as a woman advocating for innocent beings. Her social media followers grew exponentially. Supporters began organizing to help her, offering to contribute to legal fees, to assist with the creature's care, to advocate for legislative protection. Simultaneously, Dr. Wellington became the face of scientific ethics violations. Universities that had once considered him brilliant now denounced him publicly. The University of Colorado held a press conference condemning his actions and announcing internal reviews of their own genetic research protocols. Other research institutions followed suit, each concerned about their own liability and wanting to distance themselves from Wellington's crimes. Wellington's trial became a media sensation. Cameras filled the courtroom gallery. Legal analysts provided expert commentary on cable news. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. Evidence of the stolen dogs was presented. DNA analysis showing the hybrid genetic material was detailed for the jury. Financial records showing Wellington's profits were displayed. The records, the clinical documentation of the creatures he deemed unsuitable, were presented in a way that made even the judge visibly uncomfortable. The defense argued that Wellington was a visionary scientist whose work, while unconventional and ethically questionable, had advanced human understanding of genetic engineering. They characterized him as a brilliant but misguided researcher rather than a criminal. The jury wasn't sympathetic. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching a verdict. Guilty on all 27 counts. The courtroom erupted. Supporters of animal welfare cheered. Wellington's face remained expressionless as the verdict was read. During sentencing, the judge addressed Wellington directly. "You have demonstrated a complete disregard for the suffering of living creatures," the judge said, his voice heavy with disapproval. "You have violated fundamental ethical principles that guide scientific research. You have caused immeasurable pain to animals and their owners. You have created a situation that threatens established wildlife regulations and animal welfare standards. This court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison." Wellington showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. But as Sarah watched the sentencing on television, surrounded by supportive friends who'd come to her home, she realized that Wellington's conviction wasn't actually the end of the crisis. It was merely the resolution of one chapter. The far more complicated chapter, determining the fate of the creatures, establishing legal precedent for how to handle genetic engineering crimes, and figuring out how to build a future for beings who shouldn't exist but did, was just beginning. Sarah looked over at the pen where her 15 creatures were playing, their intelligent eyes watching everything. One approached the pen's edge and made a specific clicking sound. The others gathered, responding to the communication in their mysterious language. "What happens to you?" Sarah whispered, more to herself than to the creatures. "What happens to any of you now?" The question hung unanswered in the air, but it was the question driving policymakers, legislators, animal welfare advocates, and scientists across the nation. The creature's fate would set precedents that would echo through decades of future debates about genetic engineering, animal rights, and the boundaries of scientific ambition. 3 weeks after Dr. Wellington's sentencing, the Colorado State Capitol was packed with representatives, senators, animal welfare advocates, geneticists, ethicists, and media observers. The governor had called an emergency session of the General Assembly to address what was rapidly becoming known as the hybrid creature crisis. It was arguably the most ethically complex legislative situation the state had faced in decades. The debate centered on a deceptively simple question: what legal status should the hybrid creatures possess? Were they animals subject to existing animal welfare laws? If so, which laws applied? Were they wildlife that fell under the jurisdiction of Colorado Parks and Wildlife? If so, could they be euthanized as a danger to ecosystems? Were they the property of their handlers, subject to ownership laws? Were they something entirely new that required entirely new legal categories? The complications exponentially when legislators began considering the implications of their decisions. State Senator, a conservative from rural Colorado, stood before the legislature and made an impassioned argument for. "These creatures are not natural," said, his voice carrying the certainty of absolute conviction. "They are genetic experiments created through unethical science. They are not dogs. They are not wild animals. They are abominations that never should have existed. The most humane thing we can do is to end their suffering immediately and prevent the creation of any more." Argument was straightforward and appealed to a significant portion of the legislature and the public. If the creatures were mistakes of science, perhaps the ethical response was to correct that mistake by ending their lives quickly and humanely. But State Representative Jennifer countered with her own passionate argument. "If we euthanize these creatures simply because they shouldn't exist, what precedent are we setting?" asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Do we euthanize any being that shouldn't naturally exist? What about children born with genetic disorders? What about people whose existence is the result of scientific intervention? Once we start eliminating beings because they're not natural, where does that stop?" His point touched on something profound and troubling. The creatures, while unusual, were living beings that demonstrated consciousness, emotional capacity, and individual personalities. One of Sarah's 15 had formed a deep attachment to her, refusing to eat when she was gone. Another had grieved when one of its siblings became ill. Could these emotional displays be dismissed as mere biological programming? A third perspective came from Dr. Robert Harrison, a bioethicist from the University of Colorado who, before the legislature, "We must acknowledge a fundamental truth," Harrison said carefully. "These creatures exist. Whether we approve of their creation or not, they are alive. They are conscious. They suffer. They have, in every meaningful sense, entered into existence and established relationships with their environments and caregivers. To euthanize them would be to make a statement about our willingness to eliminate inconvenient life. That is a deeply troubling ethical position." Harrison went on to propose an alternative framework. Rather than asking whether these creatures should be euthanized, perhaps we should ask what our responsibilities are to beings that we or our predecessors created. Science creates consequences. Sometimes those consequences are living, conscious beings. Our ethical obligation is not to erase those consequences, but to manage them compassionately. The legislature was torn. Conservative members argued strenuously for, viewing it as the most pragmatic response to an impossible situation. Liberal members argued equally strenuously for protection, viewing as an abandonment of ethical responsibility. Moderate members were genuinely uncertain, seeing validity in arguments on both sides. Meanwhile, a federal task force was assembled to address the interstate dimensions of the crisis. The task force included representatives from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, and several scientific advisory boards. Their mandate was to determine whether existing federal wildlife laws applied to the hybrids, and if not, what new federal regulations might be necessary. The task force's first major decision was to classify the creatures as a protected species under federal law, not because they naturally occurred, but precisely because they didn't. The decision prevented any state from unilaterally deciding to euthanize the creatures without federal approval. It also created a legal framework that acknowledged the creatures as something worthy of protection and study. "We are not saying these creatures are natural or that their creation was ethical," explained Dr. Richard in a press conference announcing the federal decision. "We are saying that these creatures exist, they are alive, and they deserve legal protections that ensure their welfare is considered in all future decisions regarding them." But even as the legal frameworks developed, the moral questions became more complicated. Ethicists published papers from opposing perspectives. Dr. James Singer wrote a controversial piece titled "The Ethics of Erasing Our Mistakes," arguing that would set a terrifying precedent about society's willingness to eliminate inconvenient life. Dr. countered with "the right to refuse a cruel existence," arguing that it might be more ethical to prevent the creatures from suffering an unnatural life by euthanizing them quickly and humanely. Religious leaders grappled with profound theological questions. If God created humans in His image and gave humanity dominion over creation, did that dominion extend to creatures created through human genetic engineering? Did they have souls? Could they go to heaven? One prominent theologian argued that the creatures were soulless genetic constructs. Another argued that any conscious being deserved to be considered part of God's creation and deserving of compassion. The most emotionally powerful testimony came during a legislative hearing when Sarah Martinez brought one of her 15 creatures, the one most attached to her, into the hearing chamber. The creature was visibly nervous, making soft clicking sounds as it clung close to Sarah. But gradually, as Sarah spoke about the creature's individual personality, its capacity for love, its demonstrated ability to grieve and to bond, the emotional impact on the legislators was palpable. "This is Jasper," Sarah said, stroking the creature's head. "I don't know exactly what Jasper is. Jasper is a hybrid. Jasper shouldn't exist, but Jasper does exist. And Jasper is capable of love. Jasper mourned when one of his siblings became ill. Jasper seeks comfort from me when he's frightened. Jasper watches sunsets as if trying to understand beauty. Are these not the qualities we value in sentient beings? Are these not reasons to protect rather than eliminate?" Several legislators openly wept as they watched Sarah interact with Jasper. The creature's obvious attachment to Sarah and Sarah's obvious love for the creature created an emotional reality that transcended abstract philosophical arguments. After weeks of testimony, debate, and deliberation, the Colorado legislature passed emergency legislation that established a new legal category, protected hybrid species. The legislation declared that all hybrid creatures currently in existence would be protected from except in cases of untreatable suffering or public safety threat. No new hybrid creatures could be created except through properly licensed and federally supervised research programs with ethical oversight. All existing hybrid creatures would be the responsibility of the state, which would establish facilities to care for them humanely. A task force would be established to determine the long-term care, housing, and welfare protocols for the creatures. The legislation passed with a narrow 33-32 vote in the Senate and a slightly wider 67-63 vote in the House. The governor signed it immediately, accompanied by photographers and media. But even as legislators celebrated what they viewed as a compassionate compromise, the deeper questions remained unresolved. Where would the creatures live? Who would care for them? How would society ensure they lived meaningful lives rather than merely existing in captivity? And perhaps most profoundly, what did society owe to beings it had created through deliberate genetic engineering? Sarah received a phone call from a federal coordinator later that evening. "Congratulations," the coordinator said. "The creatures are now protected by law, but that's just the first step. Now we need to figure out where they'll live and how they'll live." Sarah looked over at her 15 creatures, playing together in their pen, their intelligent eyes reflecting the evening light. They were protected now. They wouldn't be euthanized, but their future remained uncertain, not threatened by immediate danger but complicated by questions of identity, purpose, and belonging. "What kind of future can we possibly give them?" Sarah whispered, not really expecting an answer. But Jasper, as if understanding the weight of the question, approached Sarah and rested his head against her leg, offering comfort to the woman who'd become his entire world. 6 months after the legislation passed, Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of a vast property in rural Oregon, watching bulldozers and construction crews work on what would become the world's first hybrid creature sanctuary. The property sprawled across 2,400 acres of rolling meadows, forested areas, streams, and open space. It represented the culmination of months of planning, fundraising, and coordinated effort between federal agencies, state governments, private donors, and animal welfare organizations. The sanctuary's name was Haven's Rest, a deliberately chosen title that acknowledged both the creatures' need for safety and their ongoing journey toward discovering what rest and peace could mean for beings that should never have existed. Sarah had been offered the position of senior caretaker at Haven's Rest, and she'd accepted immediately. The decision meant leaving her home in Colorado, leaving her job, leaving her former life behind. But it also meant she could continue caring for her 15 creatures and could help establish protocols for the 43 other hybrids that had been distributed across the country and were now being relocated to the sanctuary. The sanctuary's design was revolutionary. Rather than concrete enclosures and sterile environments, Haven's Rest was built to resemble natural habitat. There were large open meadows where the creatures could run freely. Forested areas provided shelter, shade, and the experience of navigating natural terrain. Multiple streams ran through the property, providing water and the sensory experience of moving water. Elevated platforms and structures provided vantage points, recognizing the creature's intelligence and their apparent need for the cognitive stimulation of exploration and problem-solving. But the sanctuary also provided something more controlled and therapeutic. There were enclosed spaces where frightened creatures could retreat. There were monitored areas where veterinarians could observe behavior and health. There were structures designed specifically for the creature's unique hybrid physiology, hybrid shelter, that acknowledged their canine need for den-like spaces, while also accommodating the predatory instincts some of them displayed. The architect who designed the sanctuary, Dr. Michael Torres, had spent months studying the creature's behavior, consulting with biologists, animal behaviorists, and engineers. His design attempted something nearly impossible, creating an environment that would allow the creatures to live as naturally as possible while also ensuring their safety and "These creatures are traumatized," Dr. Torres had explained to the sanctuary's planning committee. "They've been stolen, experimented on, scattered across the country, subjected to intensive media scrutiny, and forced to exist in legal limbo. Many of them have never experienced natural habitat, sunshine, open space, or the freedom to make choices about their own movements. The sanctuary needs to provide healing through environment." The sanctuary officially opened on a rain-slicked morning in early spring. The first arrival was a convoy of specially designed transport vehicles carrying hybrid creatures from various locations around the country. Some came from rescue situations. Others came from wealthy collectors who'd voluntarily surrendered them. A few came from zoos and research facilities that had been temporarily housing them. Sarah watched from the main sanctuary building as the transport vehicles arrived. Specialists in calm animal handling carefully led the creatures out of the vehicles and into their designated areas. The creatures were nervous, some visibly terrified by the open space, the unfamiliar sounds, the overwhelming sensory experience of a natural environment. Many had never been outside before. One creature, a hybrid named who'd been kept in a basement in Texas for 3 years, refused to leave the transport vehicle at first. It cowered in the corner, making panicked clicking sounds. Sarah approached carefully, moving slowly and deliberately. She sat down in the dirt outside the vehicle, not approaching the creature directly, just being present. For nearly an hour, Sarah sat in silence. Gradually, anxiety seemed to diminish. The creature sniffed the air, catching scents it had never experienced. It watched Sarah with intelligent eyes that seemed to be asking, "Is this safe? Can I trust this?" Finally, took tentative steps out of the vehicle. Its legs were shaky. 3 years in a basement had weakened its muscles. It took several stumbling steps and then collapsed to the ground. Sarah moved quickly, checking for injuries, finding the creature simply overwhelmed by the effort. Over the following days, Sarah and the sanctuary staff worked to help the newly arrived creatures acclimate to their new environment. Some adapted quickly, running through the meadows with obvious joy, seeming to experience freedom for the first time. Others took weeks to venture far from the shelter buildings, their trauma and fear overwhelming their curiosity. Sarah's 15 creatures, transported from Colorado, recognized her immediately upon arrival and seemed to experience the sanctuary as a homecoming. Jasper ran to her, making joyful clicking sounds. The others gathered around, seeking reassurance in her presence before gradually venturing out to explore. Within weeks, the sanctuary had become a functioning ecosystem of its own. The creatures established social hierarchies, developed relationships with one another, and began exploring the vast property. The sanctuary staff documented remarkable behaviors. The creatures learned the layout of the sanctuary, remembered water sources, and demonstrated sophisticated problem-solving when attempting to access food sources placed in deliberately challenging locations. More remarkably, the creatures developed what appeared to be culture and tradition. They established gathering places, certain meadows where they congregated at dawn, certain stream areas where they played in the water during warm afternoons. They developed vocalizations that seemed to have specific meanings understood by all the creatures. It was as if they were collectively creating a civilization. The sanctuary became renowned internationally. Documentary filmmakers were granted limited access to film the creatures in their habitat. Scientists published papers analyzing the creatures' behavior, cognitive abilities, and social structures. Schools organized educational programs where children learned about the creatures through videos and presentations, carefully crafted educational content that avoided sensationalism while acknowledging the profound ethical questions the creature's existence raised. Sarah became the public face of Haven's Rest, granting interviews and advocating for the creature's welfare and protection. She spoke at universities about genetic responsibility. She before Congress about the need for stronger regulations on genetic engineering. She became a voice for compassion toward beings created through human ambition, but innocent of wrongdoing. But perhaps the most significant impact of the sanctuary was more subtle and profound. Haven's Rest became a symbol of redemption and responsibility. It represented society's acknowledgement that when science creates consequences, even unintended consequences, those consequences deserve care, protection, and consideration. Dr. Richard, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife official who'd first identified the creature's hybrid nature, visited the sanctuary 6 months after it opened. He stood beside Sarah, watching the creatures play in a meadow, and allowed himself a rare moment of emotional reflection. "When I first examined them," Doctor said quietly, "I saw a crime and an aberration. I saw scientific ethics violations and a threat to established wildlife regulations. But watching them now, watching them live and play and connect with one another, I see something else. I see possibility. I see what responsible science might look like when it acknowledges its failures and commits to caring for the consequences." Sarah nodded, watching Jasper teach younger creatures how to navigate a stream crossing. "That's what this place is," Sarah said. "It's not a solution to the problem of their existence. They're still genetic experiments created through cruelty. That can never be erased. But it's an acknowledgement that they're alive now and their lives matter, and they deserve to live as fully and naturally as possible despite the horrific circumstances of their creation." The sanctuary's establishment had also catalyzed significant changes in genetic research oversight. New federal regulations required ethical review boards for all genetic research. Universities established stricter protocols for monitoring genetic experiments. International conferences on genetic ethics began establishing global standards for responsible genetic research. In a strange and tragic way, the creatures had become ambassadors for a new era of genetic responsibility. Their very existence, complicated and troubling as it was, had sparked conversations that would influence genetic research for decades to come. As the sun set over Haven's Rest that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah watched the creatures gradually settle into their sleeping areas. Many chose to sleep under the stars rather than in the shelter structures available to them. They curled up together in family groups, their hybrid forms silhouetted against the darkening sky. Jasper slept beside Sarah, as the creature had done almost every night since their relationship began. Sarah stroked Jasper's head gently, feeling the soft fur and the steady breathing of the creature that had become her closest companion. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, not sure if she was thanking Jasper or thanking something larger, fate, providence, or the universe's strange sense of balance that had transformed a tragedy into an opportunity for redemption and growth. Whatever these creatures were, they had changed her life immeasurably and had sparked conversations that extended far beyond their sanctuary, far beyond their existence, into the very heart of what it meant to be human in an age of unlimited technological possibility. 5 years had passed since the opening of Haven's Rest. Sarah Martinez stood at the sanctuary's observation platform on a warm summer afternoon, watching the hybrid creatures move through their world with a grace and confidence that seemed almost impossible when compared to the traumatized, frightened animals that had first arrived. The sanctuary had evolved into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. What began as an experimental solution to an unprecedented crisis had become an international model for ethical animal care, conservation science, and the responsible management of unintended genetic consequences. Universities offered courses studying Haven's Rest and its creatures. Documentary filmmakers had produced multiple award-winning films about the sanctuary and its inhabitants. The creatures themselves had become ambassadors for a new era of genetic responsibility and ethical science. Sarah was now 42 years old, her hair beginning to show threads of silver. She'd spent the last 5 years living at the sanctuary, dedicating herself entirely to the welfare of the creatures. She'd earned a second degree in animal behavior during this time, working with Haven's Rest as her primary research focus. She'd published papers in peer-reviewed journals analyzing the creatures' development, their cognitive abilities, and their capacity for emotional bonding. But perhaps more importantly, she'd become a bridge between the creatures and human society, a living embodiment of the compassion that responsible science demanded when it made mistakes. Jasper was now fully grown, nearly the size of a large German shepherd, but with the distinctive hybrid characteristics that marked him as something entirely unique. He remained Sarah's constant companion, following her through the sanctuary with the loyalty of a creature that had imprinted on her during its most vulnerable moments. There were subtle changes in their relationship over the years. Jasper had established relationships with other creatures, had become a leader within the hybrid community, and had demonstrated remarkable capacity for teaching younger creatures and establishing social structures. Yet he still sought Sarah's presence daily, still greeted her with clicking vocalizations that seemed to express affection, still rested his head against her leg in moments of quiet contemplation. The original 15 creatures from Sarah's home had thrived at the sanctuary. Several had established family groups with other hybrids, creating social structures that scientists continued to study with fascination. One creature named Maya had given birth to offspring, creatures created from hybrid parents rather than from Wellington's genetic engineering. These new hybrids demonstrated remarkable health and well-being, their development unfolding naturally without the trauma and violation that had characterized the first generation. The birth of Maya's offspring had sparked new ethical questions and new hope. If the creatures could reproduce naturally and produce viable offspring, then perhaps they represented a new species, one that had emerged through human error but might persist and evolve naturally through future generations. The question of whether they should be allowed to reproduce remained contested, but the sanctuary's ethical framework had permitted it under carefully controlled conditions. Dr. Sarah's original veterinarian ally from the beginning of this journey had retired from his practice in Denver and now served as the sanctuary's chief veterinary officer. He'd written a memoir about the case titled The Creatures That Shouldn't Be, a veterinarian's journey through science, ethics, and compassion. The book had become an unexpected bestseller, introducing millions of readers to the story of the hybrid creatures and sparking broader conversations about genetic responsibility and ethics. Doctor often reflected on how the case had transformed his understanding of his profession. "When I first discovered what these creatures were," he told Sarah during a quiet evening at the sanctuary, "I felt like I was part of a crime scene. I felt contaminated by the knowledge of what had been done to create them. But over time, I realized that my role wasn't to judge the creatures for their origins, but to serve their welfare now that they existed." That shift in perspective changed everything about how I approach my work. The sanctuary had spawned significant advances in multiple fields. Researchers studying the creature's genetic makeup had made breakthrough discoveries in understanding how different species' genes could be combined and expressed. This research, conducted ethically and transparently, was leading to legitimate medical applications, potential treatments for genetic diseases in humans, insights into how to reverse genetic disorders, understanding of genetic plasticity and adaptation. The creatures themselves, in a strange and profound way, had become tools for advancing genetic knowledge responsibly. Scientists could study them without the ethical violations that had created them. Every piece of research conducted at the sanctuary was subject to strict ethical review. Every study was designed to benefit the creature's welfare while advancing scientific understanding. The sanctuary had become a model for how genetic research could proceed ethically, even when studying beings created through unethical means. Internationally, Haven's Rest had influenced policy and practice. 23 countries had established their own hybrid creature sanctuaries, each adapted to local environments and ethical frameworks. An international conference on genetic engineering ethics, held annually at Haven's Rest, had become a prestigious gathering where researchers debated the future of genetic modification and the boundaries of acceptable scientific experimentation. The most visible legacy of the creatures, however, was in education. Millions had learned about the hybrids through documentaries, educational programs, and museum exhibitions. The creature's story had become a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical oversight, but it had also become a redemptive tale about society's capacity to acknowledge mistakes and respond with compassion rather than cruelty. Sarah had become an unexpected public intellectual, invited to speak at universities, conferences, and policy forums. She'd before Congress twice, advocating for stronger genetic research oversight. She'd given a TED Talk on genetic responsibility that had been viewed by over 20 million people. She'd been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, an unusual honor for someone working with animals rather than human populations, but recognition of the profound impact that the creature's story had had on global consciousness about ethical responsibility. Dr. Wellington remained in federal prison, where he'd served 5 years of his 15-year sentence. He'd become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition, and his case was taught in ethics courses worldwide as an example of how personal obsession could override ethical boundaries and cause immense suffering. Wellington himself had apparently experienced no reformation or remorse. According to reports from his prison counselors, he continued to view his work as revolutionary and himself as a visionary scientist, punished by society for being too far ahead of his time. On this particular summer afternoon, Sarah sat with a group of journalists who'd been granted access to document the sanctuary's 5-year anniversary. They watched as the creatures played together in the meadow, their movements natural and joyful, their social interactions complex and clearly cooperative. "These creatures exist because of a crime," Sarah explained to the journalists. "They exist because a man became obsessed with playing God and was willing to violate living beings to accomplish his vision. That trauma and violation is part of their origin story forever. It can never be erased. But what we've tried to demonstrate here is that acknowledging that trauma doesn't mean accepting cruelty. It means responding with responsibility, compassion, and a commitment to ensuring that these beings can live as full and meaningful lives as possible despite the horrific circumstances of their creation." One journalist asked the question that Sarah had been asked countless times over the years. "Do you think it was right that they were allowed to live? Should they have been euthanized?" Sarah paused, considering the question carefully. "I think if they had been euthanized, we would have lost an opportunity to learn something profound about responsibility and ethics," she said finally. "These creatures taught us that we cannot simply erase our mistakes. We must live with the consequences of our ambitions, and we must treat those consequences, even when they're uncomfortable and complicated, with dignity and compassion. That's a lesson that extends far beyond these creatures." As the sun began to set, painting the sanctuary in golden light, Sarah walked through the meadow with Jasper at her side. The creature made soft clicking sounds, the communication that Sarah had learned to recognize as contentment and affection. Around them, other hybrids gathered, preparing for their evening rest. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them all here, from that shocking birth in a veterinary hospital to this moment of peace and acceptance. She thought about Dr. Wellington's obsession with creating the perfect hybrid, and how his vision had been so twisted by ego and ambition that he'd failed to see the profound ethical violations inherent in his work. She thought about society's initial fear and outrage, and how that fear had gradually transformed into compassion as people recognized the creature's consciousness and capacity for emotional connection. She thought about the legislation that had protected the creatures, the sanctuary that had been built to care for them, and the global movement toward genetic responsibility that their story had catalyzed. "You changed the world," Sarah whispered to Jasper, stroking his head. "Not because you're special or perfect, but because you exist as proof that we can choose compassion over cruelty, responsibility over ambition, and care over judgment." Jasper rested his head against Sarah's leg, and together they watched the other creatures settle into the sanctuary for the night, creatures that shouldn't exist, that had been created through violation and greed, but that had become living reminders that even the most profound mistakes can lead to unexpected growth, learning, and transformation. The legacy of the 15 creatures from that shocking birth 5 years ago wasn't measured in scientific discoveries alone, though those had been significant. It wasn't measured in policy changes alone, though those had been important. The true legacy was in hearts and minds, in a global awakening to the responsibility that comes with genetic power, in a commitment to ethical boundaries in scientific research, and in the revolutionary understanding that compassion and responsibility weren't obstacles to scientific progress, but rather essential components of it. As darkness fell over Haven's Rest, Sarah stood looking up at the stars, grateful for the impossible journey that had brought her to this moment, grateful for the creatures that had taught her about resilience and redemption, and grateful for the opportunity to help build a future where genetic engineering might proceed with wisdom, ethics, and an unwavering commitment to the welfare of all conscious beings, whether naturally created or deliberately engineered.